Most people think of gluten as a gut issue. And yes, digestive symptoms are the most obvious sign that someone does not tolerate gluten well. But in practice, the second most common pattern I see with gluten is how it impacts the brain and mental health. So symptoms like anxiety, depression, irritability, and brain fog. So in this video, I'm going to clarify the different types of gluten reactivity, show you the psychiatric research linking gluten to mood, and then walk you through the science of how gluten actually does this. Hi, I'm Jess. I'm a clinical nutritionist, and if you're new here, this channel is all about helping women transform their mood with food and natural medicine. One of the most debated and misunderstood foods in modern nutrition is gluten. A growing body of research shows that gluten can influence inflammation, immune signaling, neurotransmitter balance, and even the brain's stress response. The tricky part is that you actually don't need celiac disease or obvious gut symptoms for this to matter. And that's why before we get into the mechanisms of action behind how gluten does this, it's really important to clarify the different categories of gluten reactivity because not all gluten reactions are the same. The good news is that it's actually pretty simple. There are three main categories that people fall into. So let's talk about the first category, which is celiac disease. Celiac disease is an autoimmune condition that's triggered by gluten, not a gluten allergy. In celiac disease, the immune system reacts to gluten and causes damage to the lining of the small intestine. This is where you see damage to the microvilli, the tiny finger-like structures that help you absorb nutrients. Today, celiac disease is identified through a combination of blood markers and genetic testing. From a genetic standpoint, there are really two main genes involved. You need to carry one of these two genes in order to develop celiac disease. So if you test negative for these, then celiac disease is essentially ruled out. That being said, just because you have the gene, this does not mean that you have celiac disease. It simply means that you have the genetic risk, which is why then additional blood markers are used to determine whether or not the disease is present. The second category is non-celiac gluten sensitivity. You will see it abbreviated as NCGS. This is where a lot of people get confused, because when someone tests negative for celiac disease, they then might infer that gluten is not a problem for them, which is not necessarily true. Non-celiac gluten sensitivity refers to people who, while they do not have celiac disease and typically do not carry the genetic markers that would predispose someone to celiac disease, they still experience some reaction to gluten. And you could think of this similarly to many other food sensitivities that people have. Gluten is often just one of the strongest. The third category is a wheat allergy. This is a true allergy and is IgE mediated, similar to like if you had a peanut or shellfish allergy. It causes immediate reaction like hives, swelling, difficulty breathing, and anaphylaxis. Most people with a wheat allergy or true food allergy will likely be aware of it by adulthood. So those are the three types of gluten reactivity. When people talk about gluten in the brain or gluten and mood, they're likely not talking about a wheat allergy. For the sake of this video, most of what we're going to be talking about applies to either celiac disease or non-celiac gluten sensitivity, which exists on a spectrum of immune and inflammatory responses. So I mentioned that we were going to look at psychiatric evidence linking gluten to mood, and one of the most eye-opening examples comes from this paper that looks specifically at how gluten-related disorders show up in mental health settings. It's honestly one of my favorite papers, and I just want to share some of the top findings from it with you. So 10% of celiac disease patients are affected by psychiatric disorders, with a higher proportion of celiac disease patients exhibiting depression compared to the general public. Celiac disease can manifest in a variety of ways, hence it often being underdiagnosed. Therefore, it is a possibility that celiac disease may be misdiagnosed as depression, for example, due to lack of classical symptoms. So essentially, there are people out there that don't have any classic symptoms of what one would consider be associated with celiac disease, but it may show up in other ways and then is often totally missed. But this paper goes beyond celiac disease, reinforcing that a growing body of evidence suggests that mood symptoms are associated with a spectrum of gluten-related disorders, not just celiac disease. Recent clinical studies have found raised gluten-related antibodies in patients with bipolar, major depressive disorder, and schizophrenia, while episodes of acute mania may be associated with increased serum levels of antibodies against gliadin. Gliadin is one of the proteins that we find in gluten and in wheat. When it comes to a gluten-free diet and its effectiveness, in terms of the short-term effects for gluten and mood, the trend towards increased severity of depression symptoms in NCGS patients only after a few days of blinded gluten challenge further reinforces our findings that the ingestion of gluten plays a role in the presence of depressive symptoms, even in those without mucosal damage. So the takeaway from this is that celiac disease may be present in many psychiatric disorders, and some researchers suggest that before we commit someone to a psychiatric institute, that we screen these individuals for celiac disease. The second and probably more important takeaway is that you do not need to be diagnosed with celiac disease to have mood-related disturbances from the ingestion of gluten. And lastly, your mood may improve dramatically with adherence to a gluten-free diet. And this is where the question becomes not just whether gluten can affect your brain, your mood, and mental health, but how does it actually do this? There are several mechanisms that we're going to take a look at today for all of you fellow nerds who want to understand this deeper. And it's important to note that some of these mechanisms can be overlapping for individuals, especially for women who have PMDD, or what I refer to in our community here as like a PMDD brain. So I'll make sure that I point out those connections as they come up. Okay, so let's dive into the mechanisms of actions. The first one is really important for anyone who has anxiety, and this is one of the main reasons why I recommend that people try going gluten-free when they do have a lot of anxiety issues and disturbances. So this is GAD enzyme inhibition and neurotransmitter imbalance. So I want you to take a look at this infographic here and identify the GAD enzyme right here that I will circle. So this enzyme helps convert glutamate into GABA. So GABA is your calming and inhibitory neurotransmitter. You need this for feeling calm, chill, and at ease. What happens is if people have antibodies triggered by gluten, so we were talking about that autoimmune activity, basically this may impair GAD activity, reducing that conversion. So it messes with this conversion here, and that reduces ultimate GABA levels here. So lower GABA levels are linked to anxiety, like I mentioned, due to heightened neural excitability and stress responses, but they're also linked to depression as well, okay? So that is the first mechanism. So the second mechanism is one that you actually may be more familiar with, and that is the gut-brain axis. So the gut-brain axis is the bidirectional communication from the gut to the brain to the gut. And what happens with gluten is gluten can increase intestinal permeability, often known as leaky gut, especially in individuals with celiac disease or non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So basically what happens with this is it creates systemic inflammation, neuroinflammation, the passage of inflammatory molecules. So these are things like liposaccharides, cytokines. They basically get into the bloodstream and may reach the brain, which really contributes to neuroinflammation, and that's where we get a lot of depressive symptoms. So neuroinflammation is highly associated with depressive symptoms. Gluten may also cause some microbiome changes, so it can alter the gut microbiota composition, which may impact serotonin synthesis, since 90% of serotonin is produced in the gut. Okay. Third mechanism, we're going to talk more about the immune system and cytokine production. So gluten-related immune responses can increase those pro-inflammatory cytokines, and those have been linked to depression through effects of neurotransmitter metabolism, neuroendocrine function, and neuroplasticity. So basically it causes a form of low-grade chronic inflammation. Another thing that happens, which is really interesting, is inflammation can actually divert tryptophan metabolism from serotonin production towards more of a neurotoxic pathway that may also contribute to depressive symptoms. So basically it's a type of tryptophan metabolism disruption. And like we mentioned how serotonin is produced in the gut, serotonin is your neurotransmitter, the happy neurotransmitter. Tryptophan is the precursor to serotonin. So the next mechanism is one that I really want my female audience to pay attention to. This is HPA axis dysregulation. You've probably heard about HPA axis, its association with adrenal fatigue, stuff like that, and just stress in general. So gluten-induced inflammation and immune activation. So if we are having some kind of immune activation via the ingestion of gluten, this can disrupt the HPA axis, leading to dysregulated cortisol secretion. Chronic cortisol elevation is associated with impaired neurogenesis and depressive symptoms. And the reason why this is really important is that women that have PMDD have been shown to have an increased susceptibility to HPA axis dysregulation. So this one could be kind of confusing to conceptualize, but what it's really saying is that the ingestion of something that's causing immune activation is causing another form of stress, potentially for an individual who already has a lower physiological stress resiliency. The next mechanism is really interesting, and it's one that is referred to a lot for individuals who are on the autistic spectrum or have a form of neurodivergence. And this is regarding gluteomorphins, otherwise known as opioid-like peptides that occur from the ingestion of gluten. So these peptides can cross the blood-brain barrier and bind to opioid receptors, potentially altering mood regulation, motivation, and behavior. So some research suggests that gluteomorphins may contribute to brain fog, reduce cognitive performance, and slower processing speed, potentially linked to altered dopamine signaling. So the opioid excess theory, like I mentioned before, has been proposed in conditions like autism and schizophrenia, where these peptides may contribute to behavioral and mood disturbances. Some studies have noted symptomatic improvements from gluten-free diets in these populations, although more research is certainly needed in this area. Gluten just doesn't affect the brain in one way. It can influence neurotransmitters, immune signaling, inflammation, stress hormones, and brain chemistry, often at the same time. Does this mean that gluten is inherently bad or that everyone needs to avoid it? No, and I want to be very clear about this. If you know me, or maybe you don't know me much yet, I don't believe in good and bad foods. Foods do not contain morality. They do contain specific properties that can either make them helpful or inflammatory to an individual. and completely neutral or irrelevant to another. But what it does mean is that for certain individuals, especially those with mood symptoms that don't have a clear explanation and who haven't tried a gluten-free diet for a meaningful period of time, that gluten could be an important piece of the puzzle. In this video, I really wanted to focus on the biology and the mechanisms behind the brain-gluten interactions. In my next video, I'm going to show you why many gluten-free diet trials fail and what it actually takes to test gluten properly, because this is the part a lot of people get wrong and leaves them feeling very confused. So if that's something you want to dive into, make sure you check out the upcoming video.